Hi there. Welcome to NapTime History channel. Tonight we're stepping into the most intimate chambers of ancient Egypt's palaces, where pharaohs performed daily rituals that would make even the most liberal modern therapist blush. You're about to witness ceremonies so bizarre that archaeologists literally tried to hide their discoveries for decades. And honestly, you probably won't make it through this episode without questioning everything you thought you knew about ancient dignity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global community of history insomniacs unite. All right, let's begin the story. You find yourself in the private sanctuary of Ramesses II, just before dawn in 1250 BCE. The air hangs thick with frankincense and myrrh, but there's something else, a tension that makes even the stone statues seem to lean forward in anticipation. You're witnessing what the papyrus scrolls delicately called the awakening of the divine essence, though modern Egyptologists have a much less poetic term for it. Every single morning, without fail, the pharaoh had to perform a sacred act of self-pleasure before the statue of Min, the god of fertility, to ensure the Nile would flood and crops would grow. This wasn't some optional spiritual practice like meditation or yoga. This was considered as essential as breathing. The ritual begins with purification. You watch as priests pour sacred water from golden vessels over the pharaoh's hands, chanting in low, hypnotic tones. The mainstream historical fact that most textbooks mention is that pharaohs were considered living gods, intermediaries between heaven and earth. What they don't tell you is that this divine status came with some deeply personal obligations. The pharaoh strips down to nothing but a leopard skin draped over one shoulder. Apparently, the gods were very specific about the dress code, and approaches the towering statue of Min, depicted with his characteristic raised arm and, shall we say, pronounced masculine features. Here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean desperately awkward for everyone involved, except apparently the ancient Egyptians. The pharaoh had to achieve completion while staring directly into the statue's eyes, believing that Min's spirit would enter him at the crucial moment. Court records from the Middle Kingdom period, discovered in the 1960s and promptly stuffed into museum basements, describe how some pharaohs required assistance from specially trained priestesses when age or illness made the solo performance challenging. These women held the title of Divine Hand of Adam, which sounds lovely until you realize Adam was the God who created the universe through an act of self-love. Historians still argue whether these rituals were performed daily or only during specific festivals, but the evidence leans heavily toward the daily option. Imagine the pressure, the entire kingdom's prosperity supposedly hanging on your ability to perform every single morning. No wonder pharaohs had multiple wives and concubines. They probably needed all the inspiration they could get. The quirky tidbit that rarely makes it into documentaries is that failed attempts were recorded in temple logs with euphemisms like, "The god slept deeply this morning," or "divine essence remained within." You shift uncomfortably as the ritual continues, noting how the attending priests keep their eyes firmly fixed on the floor, The one younger acolyte can't help but sneak glances, probably wondering if this is really what he signed up for when he joined the priesthood. The strangest part? This wasn't even considered the weird stuff by ancient Egyptian standards. This was just Tuesday morning, the morning ritual complete. You follow the pharaoh's entourage through marble corridors where sunlight filters through alabaster windows, casting everything in a pale, dreamy glow. But your destination isn't another throne room or temple, it's the royal beauty chambers, where Egypt's elite women are about to demonstrate that ancient skincare routines made modern chemical peels look like child's play. You're greeted by a smell that makes you immediately regret having breakfast. The unmistakable stench of fresh crocodile dung, mixed with honey and sour milk, wafting from golden bowls carried by slaves who've clearly lost their sense of smell years ago. Queen Nefertiti herself sits on an ivory stool, her face covered in a greenish-brown mask that would send modern beauty influencers screaming. The mixture contains exactly what you think it does: crocodile excrement, harvested fresh from the sacred pools where these massive reptiles lounged like scaly celebrities. The mainstream historical record confirms that ancient Egyptians were pioneers in cosmetics, creating everything from kohl eyeliner to red ochre lipstick. What it politely glosses over is their enthusiastic use of animal waste products in pursuit of eternal youth. The crocodile dung facial wasn't even the worst of it. You notice noblewomen in the corner applying a paste made from ground-up fly droppings mixed with human breast milk to their laugh lines. But here's where things take a turn from merely disgusting to genuinely disturbing. The same crocodile dung that promised glowing skin served a dual purpose: contraception. You watch as a physician, wearing linen gloves that suggest even ancient doctors had limits, carefully prepares pessaries from dried crocodile feces mixed with fermented honey. These would be inserted into places that make you grateful for modern birth control pills, even with their laundry list of side effects. The theory, according to papyrus medical texts, was that crocodiles never seemed to have too many babies at once, so surely their waste products contained some magical limiting properties. The fact that it probably worked had more to do with creating an environment so hostile that no sperm could survive the journey. But hey, results are results. The quirky historical tidbit that archaeologists love to whisper about at conferences involves the harvest methods. Crocodile dung collectors, yes, that was an actual job title, had to wait for the sacred temple crocodiles to do their business on specially designed platforms. These platforms were made of polished limestone with grooves that channeled the waste into collection vessels. The fresher the better, apparently, which meant some poor soul had the job of basically stalking crocodiles with a bucket, waiting for nature to call. They were paid handsomely for their troubles, often earning more than skilled craftsmen, which proves that hazard pay isn't a modern invention. You notice the women chatting casually as they smear these horrifying concoctions on their faces, discussing last night's feast and whose husband was caught with which concubine. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. Imagine gossiping about your neighbor's affair while rubbing reptile feces into your pores. One woman complains that her batch smells particularly ripe today, and her friend suggests adding more lotus oil, as if that's going to help. The attending beauticians nod sagely, adjusting their recipes like master chefs tweaking a souffle. Historians still argue whether these beauty treatments were widespread or limited to the highest nobility. But tomb paintings suggest that at least among the upper classes, animal dung facials were as common as modern-day Botox. The evidence comes from detailed hieroglyphic instructions found in the tomb of Ka and Merit, which included helpful illustrations that make modern IKEA instructions look professionally written. The instructions even specified which animals produced the best results: crocodile for anti-aging, gazelle for acne, and ibis for those stubborn dark circles. The truly perverted part wasn't just the ingredients, it was the ritual surrounding their application. Women would chant prayers to Hathor, goddess of beauty, while the feces mask dried on their faces, believing that their words would be carried to the goddess through the sacred animal's waste. Some papyri describe group beauty sessions where noblewomen would compete to see who could wear the mask longest without gagging, with prizes including imported perfumes that, one hopes, smelled significantly better than what was on their faces. You leave the beauty chambers still trying to forget what you've witnessed, only to stumble into something that makes crocodile dung facials seem quaint by comparison. In the royal palace's grand hall, preparations are underway for a wedding that would make even the most open-minded family therapist reach for their emergency bourbon. The bride and groom stand before the altar of Isis, draped in gold and lapis lazuli, and they share exactly the same nose, the same curved lips, the same distinctive chin, because they share exactly the same parents. You're witnessing a royal sibling marriage, as normal in ancient Egypt as arguing about politics at Thanksgiving dinner is today. The mainstream historical fact every schoolchild learns is that Cleopatra married her brothers. But what they don't mention is the intricate theological reasoning that made these unions not just acceptable, but divinely mandated. You listen as the high priest drones on about keeping the blood of Ra pure, about how the gods themselves married their siblings, Isis and Osiris, Nut and Geb, Shu and Tefnut, setting a precedent that apparently trumped any concerns about genetic diversity. The royal bloodline was considered literally divine, a liquid gold that couldn't be diluted with common human DNA, no matter how many Habsburg jaws that policy might produce. But here's where your modern sensibilities really start screaming. These weren't platonic arrangements for political alliance, palace records, discreetly translated by Victorian scholars who probably needed fainting couches nearby, make it abundantly clear that these marriages were expected to be consummated with the same enthusiasm as any other union. You watch the siblings exchange vows that include promises to know each other as husband and wife in the manner of the gods, which is ancient Egyptian for exactly what you think it means. The wedding night protocols were explicitly documented, including helpful positions recommended by temple astronomers based on stellar alignments, because apparently even incest needed to be astrologically optimized. The quirky tidbit that makes Egyptologists squirm involves the practice of practice marriages among royal children. Young princes and princesses were encouraged to play house together from an early age, with court tutors providing surprisingly graphic instruction on their future marital duties. Tomb paintings from the Middle Kingdom show these educational sessions, though most museums display them with strategic pieces of papyrus covering the more instructional portions. One recovered text describes a 12-year-old prince complaining to his tutor that his sister smells like the fish market and asking if he could marry a cousin instead, only to be sternly reminded that diluting the divine bloodline was tantamount to treason. You notice the wedding guests treating this whole affair as perfectly normal, raising cups of beer. Yes, the ancient Egyptians loved their beer in toasts to the couple's fertility. The irony, lost on no one except apparently the ancient Egyptians themselves, is that these incestuous unions often produced exactly the kind of offspring you'd expect from a limited gene pool. King Tutankhamun, probably the most famous product of royal inbreeding, had a club foot, a cleft palate, and a spine that looked like a question mark. But the solution to genetic deformities wasn't to maybe marry outside the family. It was to double down and marry even closer relatives, because surely the gods would eventually reward such dedication to purity. Historians still argue whether these sibling marriages were genuine love matches or purely ceremonial arrangements with discrete extramarital arrangements on the side. The evidence suggests both scenarios occurred, sometimes simultaneously. Love poems between royal siblings have been recovered that would make Game of Thrones look tasteful, featuring lines like, "Your body is my temple, O brother of my womb," and "Let us create life as our parents created us," in divine unity. The fact that court physicians kept detailed records of menstrual cycles and optimal breeding windows for sister wives suggests these unions were definitely not just for show. The wedding ceremony continues with rituals that make you deeply grateful for modern marriage customs. The couple drinks from a cup containing a mixture of wine, honey, and drops of their own blood, because nothing says eternal love like a hepatitis risk, while priests burn incense mixed with their childhood hair. The marriage contract, carved into stone tablets, includes clauses about what happens if either sibling develops an aversion to their divine duty, with remedies ranging from aphrodisiac treatments involving more crocodile products — these people really had a thing for crocodiles — to ritual purification in the Nile. The wedding feast that follows introduces you to a sight that makes the sibling marriage seem almost vanilla: an enormous parade of priests carrying lettuce, not just any lettuce, specifically cause lettuce, standing proud and erect at nearly 2 feet tall, carried on golden platters like vegetable royalty. You're about to discover why ancient Egyptian men considered this humble salad green the ultimate symbol of virility, and why the god men's festivals involved public displays that would get you arrested in 49 states today. The priests begin a chant that roughly translates to, "Behold the divine emission," and you realize with growing horror that this is going exactly where you think it's going. Min, the god of fertility, whose statue you encountered during the pharaoh's morning ritual, had an origin story that would make creation myths from other cultures blush and stammer. According to temple texts, he created the first humans by pleasuring himself so enthusiastically that his divine essence became the Milky Way. But here's the twist that makes even seasoned Egyptologists giggle nervously. Min's sacred emission was believed to look exactly like the milky sap that oozes from broken lettuce stems. Some divine marketing genius in the Old Kingdom made this connection, and suddenly lettuce became the most sexually charged vegetable in human history. The mainstream historical record acknowledges that lettuce was associated with fertility in ancient Egypt, but it tends to skip over the explicit details of how this connection was celebrated. You watch as priests break the lettuce stems over bowls, collecting the white sap with the reverence usually reserved for holy water. This sap would be mixed with honey and herbs to create a potion that men drank before attempting to conceive children, convinced it would give them men-like potency. The fact that lettuce contains lactocarium, a mild sedative, meant that most men probably felt more like napping than procreating. But placebo effects are powerful things. The festival reaches its climax, pun unfortunately intended, when the high priest of men performs what texts call the recreation of divine release, standing before a massive lettuce garden planted specifically for this ceremony. He reenacts Min's creative act while the crowd cheers and throws lotus petals. This wasn't some fringe cult activity. This was a state-sponsored religious festival attended by nobility and commoners alike. Parents brought their children. Vendors sold snacks. And everyone pretended this was totally normal behavior for a Thursday afternoon. The quirky historical tidbit that rarely makes it into textbooks involves competitive lettuce cultivation, where different nomes, provinces, would compete to grow the largest, most sap-producing specimens, with winners receiving tax breaks and the honor of supplying the royal bedroom with fertility salads. You notice noble women in the crowd carrying small lettuce amulets, rubbing them whenever they pass an attractive man, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of swiping right. Some women take this further, ordering salads made entirely of lettuce for their husbands, believing that consuming enough of Min's vegetable would turn even the most lackadaisical lover into a dynastic stud. Palace records describe one queen who insisted her husband eat lettuce with every meal for a month after failing to produce an heir, leading to what scribes delicately referred to as an excess of divine enthusiasm requiring medical attention. Yet historians still argue whether the lettuce cult was primarily religious or had practical medical benefits that ancient Egyptians stumbled upon accidentally. Modern analysis shows that lettuce does contain small amounts of vitamin E and other compounds that might marginally affect fertility, but probably not enough to justify the elaborate rituals. The more likely explanation is that someone noticed the visual similarity between lettuce sap and other fluids and built an entire theological system around it, because humans have always been exactly this weird. The festival continues with competitions that would make modern county fairs look dignified. Men compete to see who can make lettuce weep the fastest using only their hands, while priests judge the quality and quantity of sap produced. Winners receive blessed amulets shaped like Min's distinctive raised arm, though what they're supposed to do with a giant golden fist is anyone's guess. Meanwhile, temple prostitutes dressed as lettuce leaves dance through the crowd, offering their services to help channel Min's fertility blessing, because apparently vegetable costumes were considered sexy in ancient Egypt. The lettuce festival's euphoria fades as you're led down stone steps into the cool darkness of the temple's mortuary complex, where the sacred art of mummification supposedly preserves bodies for eternal life. But you're about to discover that some embalmers had very different ideas about what to do with fresh corpses, particularly the beautiful ones. The smell hits first: natron salt, palm wine, and something sickeningly sweet that makes your stomach perform acrobatics. You've stumbled into ancient Egypt's darkest open secret, the necrophilic embalmers, who turned sacred preparation chambers into scenes that would horrify even the most jaded crime scene investigator. The mainstream historical narrative presents embalmers as dignified priests performing holy work, carefully preserving bodies for their journey through the afterlife. What it conveniently omits are the papyrus court records, hidden in museum vaults and written in euphemistic hieroglyphs that took decades to properly translate. These documents detail numerous cases of embalmers caught in unauthorized preservation techniques with recently deceased nobles, particularly young women who died suddenly and arrived at the mortuary temples still warm. The ancient Egyptian solution wasn't to improve oversight. It was to create an entire system of delays and deceptions to protect the dead from the very people meant to prepare them for eternity. You watch as a noble family argues with the mortuary priests about timing, and suddenly their insistence makes horrible sense. Families of beautiful women who died young would keep the bodies at home for 3 or 4 days until decomposition made them less appealing to potential violators. They called this allowing the Ka to fully separate, but everyone knew the real reason. The quirky historical detail that archaeologists whisper about involves specialized guards called Watchers of the Beautiful Dead, whose entire job was to stand vigil over attractive corpses during the embalming process. These guards were typically eunuchs or elderly women, chosen specifically because they were considered less likely to be tempted by the temporarily preserved bodies. The violation wasn't limited to the initial preparation phase. Some embalmers developed elaborate techniques to maintain access to bodies throughout the 70-day mummification process. Secret panels in sarcophagi, hidden chambers in mortuary temples, and even specially designed tables with convenient access points. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of systematic abuse that makes you wonder if the ancient Egyptian afterlife was really worth all this trouble. One recovered text describes a head embalmer who kept a private collection of preservation experiments that were discovered only when a flood damaged his workshop walls, revealing a chamber that investigators described with terms that translate roughly to abomination against Ma'at. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Some clients specifically requested these services, paying extra for embalmers known to provide special attention to their deceased enemies or rivals. Imagine hating someone so much that you arrange for their posthumous violation. That's a level of pettiness that makes modern revenge porn look almost quaint. Temple records describe one nobleman who paid for his dead rival's wife to receive extensive preservation procedures as a final insult, though whether the woman's Ka was supposed to be aware of this in the afterlife remains theologically unclear. Historians still argue whether these practices were aberrations or more widespread than anyone wants to admit. The evidence suggests that while not universal, necrophilic abuse in mortuary temples was common enough to require official policies and countermeasures. The Edwin Smith Papyrus includes medical procedures for determining whether a body had been improperly handled during mummification, suggesting families sometimes demanded investigations. The tests involved checking for specific types of damage that wouldn't occur during normal preservation procedures, details that make modern forensic pathology look like light reading. The protective measures families took grew increasingly elaborate over time. Wealthy families hired private embalmers who worked under constant supervision, while others opted for rushed jobs that minimized handling time. Some tombs from the late period include curses specifically targeting embalmers who touched what should not be touched, with threatened punishments ranging from genital rot to eternal impotence in the afterlife. The fact that they felt such curses were necessary tells you everything about how common the problem must have been. You notice fresh mummies arriving wrapped in multiple shrouds, sealed with wax stamps, each layer requiring witnesses to remove an ancient Egyptian tamper-evident packaging system designed to protect the dead from the very professionals entrusted with their eternal preservation. Leaving the mortuary chambers with their unspeakable secrets, you emerge into blazing sunlight where drums thunder across Memphis's main plaza. A crowd of thousands has gathered, their excitement palpable as they await the afternoon's main event. But this isn't a gladiatorial contest or public execution. It's something that makes both those activities seem reasonably normal. You're about to witness the sacred Apis bull mounting ceremony, where political alliances are sealed by watching a divine bovine do what comes naturally to specially selected cows. The smell of incense can't quite mask the agricultural aromas wafting from the sacred paddock, and you realize with growing unease that you're expected to not just watch, but participate in the ritual cheering. The Apis bull, identified by 29 sacred markings, including a scarab-shaped patch under his tongue and an eagle-shaped mark on his back, wasn't just any barnyard animal. This massive black bull was considered the living incarnation of Ptah, creator god of Memphis, and his every movement was scrutinized for divine messages. The mainstream historical record mentions the Apis bull's importance in Egyptian religion, but tactfully glosses over the fertility demonstrations that made him truly sacred. What you're witnessing is the quarterly ritual where the bull proved his divinity by successfully mating with 7 cows in succession, each representing a different nome of Egypt. While priests interpreted his technique for political prophecies, the ceremony begins with the bull being led out in golden chains, his horns capped with electrum and his back draped with jeweled cloth that does nothing to hide his obvious enthusiasm for the proceedings. Palace officials take careful notes on which cow he approaches first. If he goes for the one representing Thebes, it means that region will have good floods this year. If he struggles with the cow from Nubia, military campaigns in the south might face difficulties. The fact that they're basing governmental policy on which cow a bull finds most attractive would be hilarious if everyone wasn't taking it so deadly seriously. You watch diplomats furiously scribbling observations like vigorous mounting technique suggests strong harvest with straight faces. The quirky historical detail that makes even seasoned Egyptologists blush involves the role of the bull whisperers, priestesses who had to ensure the Apis bull performed adequately. These women used various techniques to encourage the sacred animal, including strategic positioning of the cows, aromatic herbs that apparently drove bulls wild, and what one papyrus delicately describes as manual encouragement when divine inspiration falters. Imagine having helped God's bull achieve erection on your resume. These priestesses were highly respected and well paid, which tells you something about ancient Egyptian priorities. But the truly perverted aspect wasn't just the public nature of the spectacle, it was how humans tried to channel the bull's potency. Noble couples struggling with fertility would pay enormous sums to stand directly behind the mounting bull, believing that being splashed with divine bodily fluids would cure their reproductive issues. Palace ladies carried vials to collect any sacred emissions, which would later be mixed into fertility potions that probably caused more infections than pregnancies. Some particularly desperate nobles would request to touch the bull during the act, leading to several recorded instances of divine hoof-based injuries that scribes struggled to describe diplomatically. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies were purely religious or served a practical animal husbandry function with theological window dressing. The evidence suggests both. The Egyptians were excellent cattle breeders who probably figured out that advertising their best bull's prowess was good for business and religion simultaneously. Temple records show that stud fees for bulls blessed by proximity to the Apis could triple overnight, creating an entire industry of sacred cattle pimping that would make modern horse breeding look positively pedestrian. The political implications of a failed performance were severe. If the Apis bull showed no interest in the cows, it predicted famine, war, or dynastic change. You watch as tension builds when the bull initially ignores the cow representing Memphis itself, causing near panic among the priests until they remember they forgot to remove her calf from a nearby pen. Once the distraction is eliminated, divine nature takes its course, and the crowd erupts in celebration. Officials who moments ago looked ready to flee the country now beam with relief, already composing reports about the bull's exceptional divine vigor and what it means for tax collection season. The ceremony concludes with the bull being led back to his temple, followed by the very pregnant cows from previous ceremonies, living proof of divine fertility that tourists could visit for a small donation. The sacred bull's performance still echoing in your mind, you're ushered into a more secluded area of the temple complex where the air grows thick with myrrh and something metallic. You've entered the domain of the priestesses of Isis, where monthly blood becomes magical ink and menstruation transforms from biological function to supernatural weapon. The walls are painted with red ochre in patterns that suddenly make disturbing sense, their calendars tracking the cycles of every priestess, noblewoman, and even the pharaoh's daughters. This is where ancient Egypt's most intimate female mystery meets political power in ways that would make modern biohackers look like amateurs playing with mood rings. The mainstream historical record acknowledges that ancient Egyptians had surprisingly advanced knowledge of women's health, but it carefully sidesteps the magical applications of menstrual blood that dominated palace intrigue. You watch as priestesses collect their monthly flow in sacred vessels made from meteoric iron, because apparently regular metal wasn't special enough for divine feminine essence. This blood wasn't waste to be hidden. It was the primary ingredient in protection spells that pharaohs wore into battle, love potions that could topple dynasties, and curses that made enemies' genitals shrivel like dates in the desert sun. The fact that it actually worked sometimes had less to do with magic and more to do with the psychological warfare of knowing your enemy was wearing your wife's menstrual blood as war paint. The collection process itself involves rituals that make modern moon circles look like casual coffee dates. Priestesses spend their bleeding days in special chambers where every drop is caught on linen strips that are later boiled down to create concentrated essence. They follow specific diets during menstruation, lots of those fertility lettuce leaves from men's festival, naturally, believing it enhanced their blood's magical properties. The quirky historical tidbit involves competitive bleeding, where priestesses would compare the quantity and quality of their flow, with the heaviest bleeders earning privileged positions, preparing the most powerful spells. Imagine losing a promotion because your coworker had a heavier period. Ancient Egypt really was a different world. You witness the preparation of a protection amulet for a royal infant, which requires blood from 7 different women in 7 different cycle phases mixed with honey. Crocodile fat. These people seriously couldn't leave crocodiles alone. And ground pearls. The mixture is painted in symbols on leather that will be sewn into the child's clothing, theoretically protecting them from everything from scorpion stings to succession disputes. Palace records describe one queen who insisted on using only her own blood for her son's protection spells, collecting it for months to have enough supply, which is either touching maternal dedication or deeply disturbing obsession, depending on your perspective. But here's where things get truly dark. Menstrual blood wasn't just used for protection. It was ancient Egypt's most feared biological weapon. Curses written in menstrual blood were believed to be unbreakable, and the threat of such a curse could end political careers faster than a Twitter scandal. One papyrus describes a nobleman who committed suicide rather than face a curse written in his ex-wife's menstrual blood. Though whether this was due to genuine belief or the social humiliation of everyone knowing he'd been period cursed remains unclear. The most powerful curse involved collecting blood from a woman who died during menstruation, which was considered so dangerous that even discussing it required purification rituals. Historians still argue whether these practices represent early biotechnology or pure superstition, but evidence suggests the Egyptians stumbled onto some legitimate antimicrobial properties of menstrual blood, which contains higher levels of certain antibodies. Of course, they attributed this to divine feminine power rather than immunology, leading to elaborate theological explanations for why women who were unclean in other cultures were considered most magically potent in Egypt. Temple medical texts describe using menstrual blood to treat infections. though the success rate probably had more to do with witch infections than any magical properties. The political implications of menstrual magic created an entire shadow economy of blood trading. Noble women would sell their monthly flow to the highest bidder, with virgin blood commanding premium prices and the blood of proven mothers valued for fertility spells. Some enterprising women figured out how to fake their periods using animal blood and beet juice, leading to an arms race of authentication methods that included taste tests performed by specialized priests who presumably questioned their career choices daily. You leave the blood chambers feeling faintly nauseous, carrying a blessed amulet that you're pretty sure you'll be throwing in the Nile at the first opportunity. The menstrual blood chambers fade behind you as you're drawn deeper into the temple's most sacred precinct, where creation myths aren't just stories, but instruction manuals. Here, in a chamber whose ceiling depicts the cosmos being born from divine ecstasy, priests reenact the universe's most awkward origin story. You're about to discover that when ancient Egyptians said their gods created existence through self-pleasure, they meant it literally, and they had detailed theological discussions about the metaphysics of divine masturbation that would make modern philosophy departments spontaneously combust from second-hand embarrassment. According to the Heliopolitan creation myth, Adam stood alone in the primordial waters of none with a problem. He was the only being in existence and needed to create more. His solution, carved in explicit detail on these very walls, was to pleasure himself until his divine essence split into shu, air, and tefnut, moisture, which gives whole new meaning to the phrase, the breath of life. The mainstream historical record mentions this creation story in passing, usually with Victorian-era translations that turn grasped his phallus into held his scepter, as if ancient gods were just really enthusiastic about royal regalia. But the hieroglyphs don't lie, and neither do the ritual reenactments you're watching. The ceremony begins with the high priest of Adam donning a costume that's essentially a golden codpiece and nothing else. Because subtlety died about 3 temples ago, he stands in a pool meant to represent the primordial waters, surrounded by junior priests chanting mathematical formulas about the sacred geometry of self-love. Yes, you heard that right. The Egyptians developed an entire branch of mathematics dedicated to calculating the optimal angles and rhythms for divine masturbation, complete with equations that relate the speed of hand movements to the orbits of celestial bodies. Some papyri even include diagrams that look disturbingly like they belong in a modern physics textbook. If physics textbooks included illustrated guides to cosmic onanism, the quirky historical detail that makes Egyptologists giggle nervously involves the Divine Handbook, a secret text supposedly dictated by Atum himself, describing his technique in exhaustive detail. This wasn't metaphorical. Priests literally studied the god's preferred grip, rhythm, and even what he thought about, apparently the concept of existence itself, which is either deeply philosophical or the ultimate pretentious pickup line. Temple schools taught courses on divine self-pleasure theory, complete with final exams that asked students to explain the theological difference between clockwise and counterclockwise motions. One recovered test shows a student arguing that counterclockwise creates destructive forces, which his teacher marked as incorrect but creative thinking. But wait, it gets weirder. Other gods wanted in on the creation action, leading to what can only be described as competitive cosmic masturbation mythology. Khnum created humans on his potter's wheel while simultaneously pleasuring himself, supposedly imbuing clay with divine essence, giving whole new meaning to handmade Min, our lettuce-loving friend, created the harvest through strategic self-love in the fields, which explains why ancient Egyptian farmers had such interesting scarecrows. Even female deities got involved. Ninth created the universe by stimulating herself with her own arrows, which is either empowering or the strangest use of weaponry in any mythology. Historians still argue whether these creation stories were meant literally or symbolically, but the ritual evidence suggests the Egyptians took them quite seriously. Pharaohs performed annual reenactments of Atum's creative act to ensure the universe kept existing, because apparently cosmic maintenance required regular divine self-service. One papyrus describes a pharaoh who pulled a muscle during the ceremony and tried to delegate the task to his vizier, causing a theological crisis about whether proxy masturbation counted for universe-sustaining purposes. The priests eventually decided it didn't, leading to the development of special stretching exercises for aging pharaohs. The ceremony you're watching reaches its climax, these puns write themselves, with the priest achieving divine culmination into a golden bowl, which is then mixed with Nile water and used to bless everything from newborn babies to architectural foundations. The theory was that recreating the original creative act would imbue objects with primordial power. Though you suspect most recipients didn't know exactly what was in that blessing water, you notice hieroglyphs around the chamber that translate to things like, "The hand of creation moves in mysterious ways," and "From one comes many," which sound profound until you remember the context. The priests conclude by painting their faces with white chalk to represent divine essence, looking disturbingly like they've been hit in the face with, well, exactly what they're symbolically representing. The cosmic creation ritual complete, you're escorted through perfumed corridors where the smoke of frankincense can't quite mask the underlying scent of nervous sweat and anticipation. You've arrived at the royal harem's inspection pavilion, where twice yearly, hundreds of young women undergo examinations that make modern medical checkups look respectfully distant. This isn't just about selecting concubines. It's a bizarre blend of gynecology, astrology, and competitive groping that determined who would share the pharaoh's bed and potentially mother the next god king. The inspection tables, polished limestone with strategic grooves and stirrups, look like something from a parallel universe where medical ethics took a very different evolutionary path. The mainstream historical narrative describes Egyptian harems as well-organized institutions where women lived in luxury, but it glosses over the selection process that would make reality TV producers blush. You watch as candidates, some as young as 14, are lined up naked, while inspectors, a mix of eunuch physicians, elderly priestesses, and royal wives who've aged out of bed duty, examine every possible inch of their bodies. The process starts with basic measurements: hip width, breast circumference, the distance between nipples, yes, really, and something called the divine ratio of pleasure holes that involves calipers and mathematics that definitely weren't taught in your geometry class. But the external examination is just the warm-up. Each woman must lie on the inspection table while physicians check for virginity using methods that were about as scientifically accurate as personality tests based on your favorite pizza topping. The two-finger test was considered advanced medical practice, often performed before an audience of scribes who recorded everything in excruciating detail. One papyrus describes a physician proudly announcing that a candidate's lotus gateway was tighter than a merchant's purse, which presumably was meant as a compliment, but sounds more like the world's worst poetry slam, the quirky historical tidbit that makes even jaded historians squirm involves the arousal assessment. Candidates weren't just checked for physical attributes, they had to demonstrate their capacity for pleasure. Priestesses would use ivory implements shaped like exactly what you're thinking, to test responsiveness, while astrologers took notes on which positions aligned with various constellation. Women who showed excessive enthusiasm were often rejected for potentially being too difficult to control, while those who showed no response were dismissed as dead fish. And yes, that's a literal translation from hieroglyphics. The sweet spot, apparently, was moderate responsiveness with politically appropriate moaning. Beyond the physical violations, the process included bizarre tests of other attributes. Women had to sing while being digitally examined to prove they could maintain composure during divine communion. They were asked riddles during intimate inspections to test their wit under pressure. Imagine trying to solve math problems while strangers evaluate your private parts. Some inspection records include notes like, excellent muscle control, but laughs when touched behind left knee, or symmetrical labia, but makes unfortunate bird sounds during stimulation. These weren't medical records, they were Yelp reviews for human beings. Historians still argue whether these inspections were primarily about ensuring healthy offspring or just institutionalized voyeurism with medical pretensions. The evidence suggests both motivations intertwined like lotus stems in muddy water. Successful candidates received training in the 7 sacred movements of royal pleasure, which sound like yoga positions, but were definitely not meant for public classes. Temple instructors used wooden models and helpful diagrams that look like ancient IKEA instructions for assembling humans in creative ways. The training included lessons on reading the pharaoh's moods through his divine staff's inclinations, and how to fake enthusiasm convincingly when the living God had been hitting the beer and lettuce too hard. The selection process concluded with chosen women being assigned rankings based on their inspection results. The top tier became official wives, the middle tier became concubines, and the bottom tier became practice women for royal princes, because apparently ancient Egyptian sex education was extremely hands-on. You notice rejected candidates leaving through side doors, some crying, others looking relieved to escape this particular career path. The selected women are led away to be bathed in milk and honey, their bodies now property of the state, their futures determined by how well they scored on history's most invasive job interview, The inspection pavilion is cleaned with natron salt for the next batch. The examination tables still warm from their previous occupants, waiting for tomorrow's fresh supply of candidates to undergo the same methodical violations in the name of royal breeding. From the harem's inspection chambers, you descend into the temple's inner sanctum where the air grows cold despite the desert heat above. Here, in chambers lit by flickering oil lamps, you're about to witness the most extreme body modification in ancient Egypt's arsenal of religious devotion: voluntary castration for cosmic rewards. The priests you encounter aren't just celibate. They've physically removed any possibility of earthly pleasure in exchange for promised ecstasy in the afterlife that makes heaven's 72 virgins look like a church picnic. The surgical tools displayed on the walls, bronze blades and cauterizing irons worn smooth from use, tell you this isn't theoretical theology, but practiced mutilation. The mainstream historical record mentions eunuch priests in passing, usually focusing on their administrative roles, but conveniently ignores the voluntary castration cults that flourished in certain temples. These weren't slaves forcibly neutered for harem duty. These were true believers who willingly submitted to the knife, convinced that removing their genitals would grant them eternal erections in the field of reeds. The theology, recorded in texts that Victorian translators simply refused to acknowledge, argued that earthly sexual organs were practice versions, and by sacrificing them, priests would receive upgraded divine models in the afterlife capable of infinite pleasure without exhaustion. You watch a castration ceremony beginning, and it's somehow both more ritualistic and more brutal than you imagined. The volunteer, a young priest who spent 3 years preparing for this moment, drinks a concoction of blue lotus wine mixed with opium poppy, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of general anesthesia, though probably less effective. He recites prayers that essentially amount to, "Take my balls now, give them back better later," while senior priests sharpen their blades with the focus of sushi chefs preparing fugu. The actual procedure happens fast. 2 quick cuts while other priests hold the volunteer still, followed by cauterization with an iron shaped like Osiris's face, because even genital mutilation needs branding. The quirky historical detail that makes modern body modification enthusiasts look conservative involves the preservation methods. These priests didn't just discard their removed parts, they mummified them in special canopic jars designed specifically for genitals. These jewel jars, and yes, that's what they called them, were decorated with spells, ensuring the organs would be waiting in the afterlife. Improved and ready for reinstallation, some priests went further, wearing their mummified testicles as amulets, believing it gave them magical powers. Imagine explaining that necklace at parties. "Oh, they're my balls. I'm saving them for later." But here's where theology gets truly weird. Different levels of castration promised different afterlife rewards. Basic castration, just the testicles, guaranteed eternal virility. Full penectomy promised the ability to shapeshift your divine member into any form desired. Texts describe priests fantasizing about having crocodile phalluses, ibis beaks, or even multi-purpose Swiss Army genitals. The most extreme practitioners removed everything: creating smooth surfaces that they claimed made them aerodynamic for spiritual travel. One recovered text describes a priest who regretted his choice and tried to fashion a prosthetic from a bull's pizzle, leading to infection and a theological debate about whether borrowed genitals counted for afterlife purposes. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or limited to specific cults, but the archaeological evidence of specialized surgical tools and dedicated healing chambers suggests it wasn't just a few extreme enthusiasts. The castration priests formed their own communities within temples, developing sign languages to communicate during vows of silence. Apparently, removing your genitals made you extra holy, but also extra quiet. They created elaborate hierarchies based on what they'd sacrificed. A priest who'd only removed one testicle couldn't lead prayers over one who'd gone full smooth. Temple records describe political intrigue within these communities that makes Vatican politics look straightforward, including accusations of phantom testicle syndrome, where priests were accused of faking their castrations with clever tucking techniques. The ceremony concludes with the newly castrated priest being carried to a recovery chamber where he'll spend weeks healing and probably reconsidering his life choices. Other castrated priests tend to him with the care of army medics, applying honey and natron to prevent infection while chanting about the magnificent genitals awaiting him in the afterlife. You notice hieroglyphs on the walls showing the promised upgrades, phalluses that glow like Ra's solar barge, testicles that produce infinite seed, and anatomical configurations that defy both physics and good taste. The priests seem genuinely excited about their future equipment, comparing notes on what modifications they've requested through prayer, like kids designing custom video game characters, except with genitals and eternal consequences. Leaving the castration chambers with their promises of afterlife, anatomical upgrades, you emerge into a district of Memphis that officially doesn't exist on any city plans. The Temple of Hathor here serves a dual purpose: worship and commerce of the most intimate kind. This isn't some seedy back alley operation, but a state-sanctioned, religiously endorsed brothel where having sex with strangers isn't just acceptable, but considered a form of prayer. The sacred prostitutes who work here don't hide in shadows. They wear their profession like priests wear their robes, proud servants of the goddess of love who just happen to charge by the hour. The mainstream historical record acknowledges temple prostitution in vague terms, usually buried in footnotes about ritual servants or holy companions. What it doesn't spell out is the elaborate theological framework that turned sex work into spiritual practice. According to temple doctrine, every commercial sexual encounter recreated the divine union between gods, with the prostitute serving as Hathor's earthly vessel and the client playing whatever deity they could afford to embody. Prices varied based on which god you wanted to be, incarnating as men cost extra because it involved those damn lettuce accessories, while pretending to be Bess, the dwarf god of fertility, came with a group discount. You watch as pilgrims arrive, some traveling hundreds of miles specifically for this spiritual experience. They're not furtive or ashamed. They're carrying offerings and wearing their best clothes like they're attending a wedding, which in a cosmic sense, they are. The selection process resembles something between a job interview and speed dating. Sacred prostitutes display their credentials, which gods they're certified to channel, what positions align with specific prayers, and their ratings from previous spiritual encounters. One papyrus advertises a priestess who specializes in embodying Isis for fertility blessings, with a 5-star rating and testimonials from satisfied nobles who successfully conceived after their sessions. The quirky historical detail that makes it anthropologists blush involves the training academy for sacred prostitutes. This wasn't just lie back and think of Egypt. These professionals underwent years of education in theology, anatomy, astronomy, and acting. They learned to recite prayers while maintaining specific positions, to time their performances with celestial events, and to fake divine possession convincingly enough to justify their rates. Training manuals recovered from buried temple archives include illustrated guides that make the Kama Sutra look like a children's book, with positions named things like Osiris rises from the dead and Set's chaotic penetration that required flexibility and a strong understanding of mythology. But here's the truly perverted twist. Some nobles paid for elaborate role-playing scenarios that recreated entire myths. Want to experience Set's violation of Horus? That'll be 50 gold pieces and a waiver absolving the temple of any divine wrestling injuries. Fancy reenacting the conception of Horus with an Isis impersonator while your actual wife plays Nephthys watching from the corner? There's a package deal for that. The most expensive option involved the Creation of the Universe special, where clients reenacted Adam's original masturbation but with professional assistance, because apparently even divine self-love was better with company. Historians still argue whether these temples were primarily religious institutions with a side business or brothels with good marketing. The financial records suggest both. Temples earned enormous revenues that funded legitimate religious activities, creating a circular economy where sex paid for prayers that blessed more sex. The sacred prostitutes themselves occupied a complex social position, respected for their religious role, wealthy from their work, but unable to marry or have children, thanks to regular doses of crocodile dung contraception from our earlier beauty treatment friends. Many retired to become regular priestesses. Their past profession considered excellent preparation for counseling wives on keeping their husbands faithful. Takes one to know one. Apparently, you notice the temple's architecture designed for discretion and efficiency, private chambers with multiple entrances, washing facilities between each room, and acoustic dampening to prevent one spiritual experience from disturbing another. The walls feature helpful murals showing which positions invoke which blessings. Like a spiritual menu, incense burns constantly, creating a haze that makes everyone look slightly more attractive and definitely more divine. Clients leave through different exits than they entered, some looking spiritually fulfilled, others just looking tired, but all clutching papyrus receipts that double as religious documentation, because in ancient Egypt, even visiting a sacred prostitute was tax deductible if you kept proper records. The sacred brothel's incense still clinging to your clothes. You're drawn to the palace courtyard by rhythmic drumming and chanting that makes your skin crawl with its primal intensity. Today is the annual harvest of royal essence, when the pharaoh must publicly demonstrate his divine virility to ensure Egypt's prosperity. This isn't a symbolic ritual with metaphorical seeds. This is the god king personally fertilizing ceremonial fields with his sacred bodily fluids, while thousands watch, cheer, and probably question their agricultural methods. The collection vessels, pure gold chalices carried by virgin priestesses, gleam in the afternoon sun like the world's most disturbing sports trophies. The mainstream historical record mentions the pharaoh's role in fertility rituals, but sanitizes it into blessing the fields or consecrating the harvest. What actually happens would make modern performance anxiety look like a mild case of butterflies. The pharaoh, wearing nothing but a crown and a leopard skin cape that does nothing to preserve modesty, must achieve completion 7 times during the ceremony, once for each of Egypt's major crop regions. Between each performance, he drinks that lettuce juice concoction from Min's festival mixed with bull's blood and honey, a combination that probably explains why some pharaohs died young. Court physicians stand ready with manual assistance tools that look like gold-plated medical devices from a parallel universe where urology went very wrong. You watch as the current pharaoh, a man in his 60s who clearly wishes he'd abdicated last year, begins the ritual. The crowd falls silent, except for the drums, which maintain a rhythm supposedly synchronized with the universe's heartbeat, but sounds more like cosmic pressure to perform. The pharaoh approaches the first collection vessel, held by a priestess who's trying very hard to look spiritually moved rather than uncomfortable. The theological doctrine states that the pharaoh must maintain eye contact with the sun disk of Ra throughout, adding sunburn to the list of occupational hazards. When he struggles, specially trained encouragement dancers emerge, performing movements that would get them arrested in most modern countries, but here are considered religious art. The quirky historical detail that archaeologists discovered but rarely discuss involves the backup system hidden behind curtains. Stand-in priests prepared identical-looking fluids using egg whites, honey, and sacred oils, ready to discreetly swap vessels if the pharaoh couldn't produce enough divine essence. These stunt doubles for semen, there's really no delicate way to phrase it, practiced their sleight of hand for months, developing techniques to switch vessels without anyone noticing. One papyrus describes a disaster when a nervous priest dropped the fake vessel, splattering the mixture on noble spectators, who then believed they'd been blessed by accident and refused to wash for weeks. But the public performance was just the beginning. The collected essence was then mixed with Nile water and literally sprayed over fields using special irrigation tools that looked like ceremonial water guns. Farmers would fight for positions closest to where the pharaoh's essence would land, believing direct contact guaranteed bumper crops. Some enterprising merchants sold essence-touched soil at premium prices, though how anyone verified authenticity remains a mystery. The most devoted followers would roll naked in the freshly sprayed fields, absorbing the divine fertility through their skin and probably contracting several infections in the process. Historians still argue whether these rituals had any agricultural benefit or were purely religious theater. The timing usually coincided with optimal planting seasons, suggesting the Egyptians cleverly wrapped practical farming knowledge in spectacular religious packaging. However, records show that years when elderly or impotent pharaohs struggled with the ritual often did have poor harvests. Though whether this was divine punishment or just farmers losing confidence and neglecting their fields remains debatable. The psychological impact was undeniable. Imagine being a farmer whose entire livelihood supposedly depended on whether your elderly king could successfully masturbate in public. The ceremony you're witnessing reaches its climax. The puns remain unavoidable, with the pharaoh's seventh and final performance, by which point he looks ready for mummification. The crowd erupts in celebration, throwing flower petals and performing dances that simulate agricultural fertility but look more like mass dry humping. The pharaoh is carried away on a golden litter, probably to ice whatever hurts and reconsider the job benefits of divinity. Meanwhile, priests rush the collected vessels to the fields, where the ritual spraying begins amid songs about the land receiving the seed of gods. You notice farmers discreetly adding actual seeds to the mix, suggesting that even ancient Egyptians hedged their bets when it came to agriculture. The day concludes with feasting and more fertility rituals among the common people, inspired by their pharaoh's performance to try creating the next generation of Egyptians, though hopefully with more privacy and less performance pressure. The pharaoh's public performance fades into memory as you're led to the palace's private brewing chambers, where the air hangs thick with fermentation and something far more unsettling. Here, the royal brewmasters create beverages that would violate every food safety law ever written, combining alcohol with bodily fluids in ways that make modern craft beer experiments look timid. You're about to discover the secret ingredient in the nectar of Isis, served exclusively at royal banquets. Fresh breast milk from the palace's carefully maintained stable of wet nurses, mixed with wine and honey to create a drink that supposedly granted wisdom, virility, and probably several bacterial infections. The mainstream historical record celebrates ancient Egyptian beer-making prowess, but conveniently omits their more adventurous brewing experiments. The breast milk wine wasn't some fringe concoction. It was the ancient equivalent of champagne, served at coronations, royal births, and diplomatic dinners where foreign ambassadors tried not to gag while toasting international relations. The wet nurses who provided the key ingredient weren't random lactating women, but carefully selected professionals who followed specific diets to optimize their milk's taste and supposed magical properties. They ate tons of figs, dates, and honey, avoided garlic and onions, and underwent regular taste tests by senior brewmasters who had the worst job in the palace. You watch the collection process, which involves wet nurses lined up like dairy cows, expressing milk into silver bowls while priests chant prayers to Hathor, goddess of motherhood and intoxication, a combination that suddenly makes terrible sense. The nurses compete to see who can produce the most milk, with champions receiving gold jewelry and the dubious honor of having their names inscribed on wine jars. Some nurses specialized in morning milk for energy potions, while others produced evening milk for sedative brews. The classification system rivals modern wine terminology, a robust Tuesday afternoon expression with notes of lotus and subtle undertones of papyrus, best paired with crocodile meat. The quirky historical detail that makes even hardened archaeologists queasy involves the aging process, unlike regular wine that improves with time. Breast milk, wine had to be consumed within days, or it transformed into something that violated both religious and natural law. This led to scheduling nightmares for palace events. Imagine planning a state dinner around lactation schedules. One papyrus describes a diplomatic crisis when the Nubian ambassador's visit coincided with a dry spell among the wet nurses, forcing servants to secretly dilute the sacred brew with goat's milk, which the ambassador detected and considered a mortal insult. But breast milk wine was just the beginning of Egypt's bodily fluid brewing culture. Elite parties featured cocktails mixed with saliva from sacred temple virgins, collected during religious ecstasy for maximum potency, fermented urine from pregnant mares, supposedly an aphrodisiac, and something called warrior's courage that mixed wine with blood from soldiers who'd survived multiple battles. The theory was that drinking these essences transferred their properties to the consumer, though the main property transferred was probably hepatitis. The most exclusive brew required tears from professional mourners, collected during actual funerals and mixed with honey wine to create a drink that supposedly allowed communication with the dead, but definitely communicated food poisoning. Historians still argue whether these beverages were consumed for their supposed properties or as displays of wealth and power. Only the ultra elite could afford to drink other people's bodily fluids for fun. The evidence suggests both motivations. Plus, a healthy dose of peer pressure. Palace records describe nobles pretending to enjoy breast milk wine while secretly pouring it into potted plants, which subsequently died, suggesting the drinks were as toxic as they sound. Yet refusing to partake was social suicide, leading to elaborate fake drinking techniques and discreet vomiting breaks that turned royal banquets into endurance contests. The brewing chamber includes a tasting room where you're offered a sample of fresh breast milk wine. The brewmaster describes its creamy mouthfeel with a tangy finish, while your stomach performs acrobatics that would impress Olympic judges. You notice hieroglyphs on the walls, providing mixing instructions. 2 parts wine, 1 part milk, honey to taste, and prayers to prevent curdling. The fact that they needed divine intervention to keep their drinks from separating tells you everything about the stability of these concoctions. Servants prepare batches for tonight's feast, carefully labeling each jar with the wet nurse's name, collection time, and mood during extraction, because apparently happy milk tasted better than sad milk. You politely decline a second sample and exit quickly, leaving the brewmasters to their craft, and wondering if ancient Egypt's reputation for wisdom might have been greatly exaggerated. The sour taste of breast milk wine still haunting your palate. You descend into the Valley of the Kings, where tomb workers prepare for a ceremony that pushes the boundaries of both marriage and mortality. You're about to witness a corpse wedding, where a living person marries someone who's already begun their journey through the afterlife. This isn't a symbolic ceremony with metaphorical vows. This is a legally binding union recognized by both earthly courts and supposedly the gods of the underworld, complete with dowries, property rights, and conjugal expectations that raise disturbing questions about necrophilia with extra steps. The mainstream historical record mentions that ancient Egyptians believed in maintaining relationships after death, but it glosses over the practice of post-mortem marriages that turned grief into something far more complicated. These ceremonies typically occurred when someone died shortly before their planned wedding, but ambitious families also arranged corpse marriages for political alliances, combining funeral rites with wedding celebrations in ways that made guests deeply uncomfortable about which emotion to express. The bride or groom's mummy would be specially prepared with articulated joints to allow positioning during the ceremony, because apparently rigor mortis shouldn't prevent you from exchanging rings. You watch as today's living groom, a merchant whose fiancé died of fever 3 days ago, stands before her freshly wrapped corpse, propped upright in a wedding dress that covers most of the bandages. The embalmers have done their best to make her presentable, painting eyes on her wrappings and attaching a wig that almost looks natural if you squint and have sympathy. The priest performs the standard marriage ceremony with slight modifications till death do us part becomes despite death keeping us together, and the kiss is mercifully brief. The truly disturbing part comes when the priest explains the groom's marital rights, which include regular visits to his wife's tomb for spiritual communion that sounds suspiciously physical. The quirky historical detail that makes even morbid curiosity feel inadequate involves the consummation rituals. Yes, you read that correctly. Some corpse marriages included consummation ceremonies where the living spouse would spend their wedding night in the tomb with their deceased partner. Theological doctrine held that the Ka, life force, of the dead could still experience pleasure, so denying them their wedding night would be cruel. Special funeral texts provided instructions for arousing a mummified partner, including where to burn incense, which prayers to recite, and optimal positioning that wouldn't damage the wrappings. One recovered papyrus includes troubleshooting advice for common problems like spouse's arm fell off during embrace and beetles emerging from unexpected places. But here's where ancient Egyptian bureaucracy meets eternal romance. Corpse marriages created inheritance, nightmares that make modern probate look simple. Could the living spouse inherit from their dead partner's family? Did children born after the corpse marriage to the living partner and someone else, hopefully, have claims to the dead spouse's estate? What happened if the living spouse wanted to remarry? Was bigamy with a mummy still bigamy? Temple lawyers developed entire specializations in posthumous marital law, charging premium rates to untangle disputes between families, arguing over whether their dead relatives had consented to these unions from beyond the grave. Historians still argue whether corpse marriages were acts of devotion or calculated financial moves, but evidence suggests both motivations tangled together like linen wrappings. Some tomb inscriptions show genuine grief and love, with living spouses leaving offerings and love letters for decades. Others reveal more mercenary arrangements, like the nobleman who married his brother's corpse specifically to claim his shipping business, then immediately took a living mistress. The most extreme case involved a woman who married 3 different corpses over her lifetime, becoming ancient Egypt's most successful serial widow without technically killing anyone. The ceremony concludes with the wedding feast, where half the guests celebrate while the other half mourn, creating an atmosphere of cognitive dissonance that would challenge modern event planners. The mummy bride sits at the head table, a plate of offerings before her that nobody expects her to eat. The groom makes toasts to their future together, carefully avoiding specifics about what that future might involve. Musicians play songs that can't decide if they're dirges or wedding marches, settling on something that sounds like both. You notice the groom's family exchanging glances that suggest they're reconsidering this whole arrangement, while the bride's family seems relieved to have secured their daughter's eternal happiness and their own financial security. The evening ends with the bride being carried to her tomb for the wedding night, followed by the groom, who looks like he's seriously questioning his life choices but is too deep into this cultural practice to back out now. The corpse wedding's unsettling festivities fade as you're swept into Memphis's main thoroughfare, where the annual festival of the Great Phallus has transformed the city into something that would make Mardi Gras look like a church picnic. Enormous reproductive organs parade through the streets, carved from wood, molded from clay, constructed from papyrus and reeds, some towering 3 stories high and requiring teams of priests to maneuver through the crowds. This isn't some fringe fertility cult, but Egypt's most popular religious festival, where tens of thousands gather to worship giant penises with the enthusiasm modern sports fans reserve for championship games. The mainstream historical record mentions fertility festivals in passing, using terms like processions honoring men or celebrations of regenerative power. As what it doesn't capture is the spectacular vulgarity of these events, where subtlety didn't just die, but was murdered, mummified, and paraded through town on a penis-shaped palanquin. You watch as the grand phallus of Osiris, reconstructed annually to commemorate Isis's reassembly of her dismembered husband, leads the parade. It's painted gold, decorated with jewels, and mechanically rigged to rise and fall with hydraulic precision that would impress modern engineers. Priests manipulate ropes and pulleys to make it salute important buildings, while the crowd goes wild each time it achieves full extension. The parade includes every possible phallic variation human creativity could devise. There's the war phallus, covered in bronze scales and spouting fire from its tip, because nothing says military might like a flame-throwing penis. The harvest phallus shoots seeds into the crowd, causing stampedes as people believe catching them ensures fertility. The most disturbing is the phallus of 1,000 pleasures, covered in smaller phalluses, like some recursive genital nightmare that would give fractals an inferiority complex. Children ride miniature wooden phalluses like hobby horses, while vendors sell phallus-shaped bread, phallus-shaped jewelry, and disturbingly anatomical honey cakes that make you question everything about ancient Egyptian cuisine. The quirky historical detail that makes an anthropologist's alternately giggle and cringe involves the competitive phallus building different districts spent months constructing their entries, developing innovations like articulated joints, spring-loaded mechanisms, and in one recorded case, a musical phallus that played hymns through strategically placed windpipes. The competition got so intense that espionage became common. Imagine sneaking into your neighbor's workshop to steal their secret phallus blueprints. One papyrus describes a sabotage incident where rivals weakened a phallus's support structure, causing it to collapse dramatically during the parade, which the crowd interpreted as divine impotence and terrible omens for that district's fertility. But here's the truly perverted culmination: the festival climaxes. These puns remain inevitable with the great fertilization, where the largest phallus is positioned over a ceremonial field representing Egypt itself. Priests pour sanctified oils from the tip while thousands of couples fornicate publicly in the surrounding fields, believing that conceiving during this moment guarantees blessed children. The synchronization efforts alone boggle the mind. Priests with drums and flags coordinate the crowd's activities like the world's most inappropriate orchestra conductor. Those who achieve completion simultaneously with the great phalluses offering supposedly birth future priests and priestesses, though how anyone kept track in that chaos remains mysterious. Historians still argue whether these festivals were religious expressions or just excuses for public debauchery, but the economic records suggest they were serious business. Cities invested massive resources in phallus construction. Artists specialized in genital sculpture, and merchants made fortunes selling fertility aids that ranged from herbal Viagra to strap-on accessories that would make modern sex shops look prudish. The festivals generated more revenue than military campaigns, proving that in ancient Egypt, making love literally made more money than making war. The parade continues past where you stand, each phallus more elaborate than the last, accompanied by dancers, musicians, and priests chanting hymns that sound sacred until you translate the lyrics and realize they're describing divine orgasms in theological detail. Women throw flowers at their favorite phalluses like ancient groupies, while men compete in fertility demonstrations that are exactly what they sound like. The entire city transforms into a celebration of reproductive organs that makes you appreciate modern society's relative prudishness. As the sun sets, the phalluses are positioned around the city's borders, standing guard against infertility and impotence until next year's festival, when they'll be replaced by even larger, more elaborate versions in humanity's eternal quest to impress the gods with genital architecture. As the last giant phallus disappears around a corner, its mechanical salute still echoing off temple walls, you find yourself drifting away from the festival grounds. The drums fade to distant heartbeats. The incense smoke thins to whispers, and the city's fervor softly melts into the cooling desert evening. Your journey through ancient Egypt's most intimate mysteries draws to its natural close, like the Nile's floods retreating to reveal fertile soil beneath. The images that swirled through your mind, pharaohs in their private chambers, crocodile dung beauty masks, divine bulls in their sacred moment, begin to blur and soften like papyrus in water. These weren't just shocking rituals or scandalous ceremonies, they were windows into a civilization that saw divinity in every bodily function, magic in every fluid, and cosmic significance in acts we've learned to whisper about. The ancient Egyptians didn't separate the sacred from the sexual, the divine from the disgusting. They wove them together into a tapestry that modern eyes can barely comprehend. You feel yourself settling deeper into comfort, the stone corridors and golden chambers dissolving into the familiar embrace of your own space. The voices of priests and priestesses become gentle murmurs, their chants transforming into the rhythm of your own breathing, somewhere between the last phallus parade and this moment of quiet. You've traveled not just through space and time, but through the beautiful, bizarre depths of human belief and behavior. Let the last traces of frankincense fade from your nostrils. Let the final echoes of sacred drums merge with your heartbeat. You've witnessed the whispered secrets that archaeologists found too strange to share, the rituals that challenged every boundary between reverence and revulsion. And now, as night fully embraces the ancient land and the modern world alike, you can rest knowing you've glimpsed the unfiltered truth of humanity's endless creativity in pursuing pleasure, power, and the promise of eternity. The pharaohs sleep in their tombs, their intimate mysteries preserved in stone and gold, while you return to gentler dreams, carrying just enough of their strangeness to make ordinary life seem wonderfully simple by comparison. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be blessedly free of crocodile dung and cosmic emissions.